previously a consultant working to help businesses secure their estates, their applications, and networks. And I now work internally as a security engineer for a company called Evotix. And I want to just talk a little bit about Evotix, what we are and what we do, because it's basically relevant to the presentation. It's one of the reasons that I picked this as a topic. So Evotix is a health and safety technology provider. We provide health and safety software for manufacturers, anybody that basically deals with a manufacturing floor where health and safety incidents can occur. And fundamentally, what we are is a technology business. So we have 3 products. Our first one is Assure, that targets the mid-market. That's a SaaS platform, so software as a service. So it's a multi-tenanted application where lots of different customers will use the same stack. We have a product called 360, which targets the enterprise space. And the real difference between mid-market and enterprise software is configurability. If you are a very large organization, you often have very specific requirements about what you want when you go out to procurement for products. And because you're really big, and because you're willing to spend a lot of money, you can basically demand configurations that you want. And so our enterprise level product really targets that. It's very configurable. It supports on-prem hosted installations or installations that we run for you. And then lastly, we have a product called Learn, which is a micro-learning application. Think of it as YouTube for short-form learning content. And so then I want to talk a little bit about my role. So Evotix, up until a couple of years ago, was probably a small business. That's what we would classify it as. And so what you'll find in small businesses is you have limited resources. You don't have somebody that can do somebody for every single job role. And what you find is you basically end up relying on a very small number of people to do a lot of cross-functional roles. Now, we've grown 40% year on year for the last 8 years, I think it is. So we are in the process of coming out the end of our security journey from being a small business, going through that medium business growth stage and becoming a large business ourselves. And because of that, we have seen a lot of the challenges and we've had to meet them. Because the challenges from a security perspective that you have as a small business are actually very different from the ones you have as a large business. So we've gone through that. And as a result, my role is actually very cross-functional. I spend a lot of time working with developers and the platform team. That's what I came in originally to do, helping them to implement the secure development lifecycle process, making sure that once we deploy things into production, that we have monitoring and we have capability to understand what's going on, are we protected. I work a lot with the information security team. They're typically responsible for compliance within the business, making sure we adhere to the standards we need to. Obviously working with the IT team, they'll do a lot of the day-to-day lifting in terms of implementing your security program. And then also working with business stakeholders and customers to make sure they're happy, they understand what we're trying to achieve, and that they're on board. And in terms of customers, there's nothing that gives a customer more assurance than the ability to speak to somebody that works in your business, that understands the program, and that can provide them that reassurance. So I want to talk a little bit about SMEs, like why do we even care about them? So it turns out, if you look at the statistics, 48% of people in the UK are employed in a small business. And a small business is defined as a business that has a turnover that has less than 50 employees and a turnover of under 10 million. Right? 48%. That is a lot of the working population of the country. In comparison, only 13% of people are employed by a medium-sized business, and that's defined as a business with less than 250 employees and a turnover of under 50 million. The one that really gets me is that almost 40% of people in the UK are employed by a large business, but large businesses only make up 0.1% of all businesses in the UK. And fundamentally, that means that small and medium-sized enterprises are critical to the UK economy. So their security and the longevity of them to last and not get knocked out because they get compromised, that is actually really important. And just one thing about small and medium-sized businesses as well. As much as they might start out small and medium-sized enterprises do not want to stay small, right? Their ultimate goal, typically, is that they want to become big businesses in the end. So what I really want to talk about is the ways, are the smart choices you can make early on that will help you to be secure as you go through your security journey. and as you become a bigger business. Because what we'll find is if you make bad choices early on, that can really hinder you in the future. It can force you to do things like re-architecture. Whereas if you'd have thought a little bit more clearly at the start about where your long-term needs are, you're less likely to find yourself in that position. So there's really two streams that I want to talk about. The first is general IT security, and that will apply to almost all businesses. I want to look at what are the IT security challenges that business face, how do those challenges change as you grow, and what are reasonable steps you can take to protect your business through that growth. And then I also want to talk about the technology side of it. Now, because you guys are doing a technology degree, there's a really good chance that you will end up working for a technology company of some kind, and typically that will require you to produce software. So I also want to talk about the security challenges that you face from a software development point of view, how those challenges change again as you grow, and what are good steps you can take early on to make sure that security is maintained through growth. So I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between SMEs and large enterprises. SMEs will typically be focused on growth. Now, in terms of growth, that usually requires the prioritization of new features, especially if you are producing software, over other factors like investing in security. Because it's much easier to sell to a customer by saying, this great feature that you want, we've got that coming. That's coming in a couple of months. It's much harder to say, well, actually, we were going to do that, but we've decided we need to implement a security compliance program, so it's actually going to be 2 years before you can get that. That makes selling a lot more difficult. And as a result, you have a lot less buy-in from management. If you want to make security a priority in your business from like a security employee point of view, you have to really push it, and you have to make sure your SLT really understand the value. And we're going to see that that's a real common theme throughout this. If you want a good security program as a small business, you really have to be supported by senior leadership, otherwise it's not going to work. Again, I briefly mentioned it. What you'll typically find is that in small businesses you have a limited amount of staff, so you have to cover multiple roles. And as a result, you really rely on your generalists, people that are, you all have them. You might refer to them as a superstar in a business, somebody that is just good at everything. They have a little bit of knowledge about every domain, and you will rely on them significantly. The problem as well, if you're a small business, you typically have you have worse view on your assets. So you don't really understand what it is you're trying to protect. But the flip side of that is, because you're small, you typically have less to protect. When it comes to hiring security talent, you will be less well known in the market, and you'll probably find that you're therefore less attractive to people that you might want to hire. So for example, if your choice is between working for a tiny company that nobody's ever heard of, or working for Apple, most people are going to pick Apple, right? So that is a problem that you have to contend with, and sometimes that requires you to up your remuneration in order to bring people in. Now, if you're a large enterprise, you've probably gone through a security journey. I can't imagine many large businesses now that will not have. And as a result, you probably already have some sort of maturity in your cybersecurity practices, probably driven by your compliance requirements. You'll have bigger budgets, and because you're a big enterprise, you will have the efficiency of scale. The bigger you are, the easier it is to negotiate with your suppliers. And unfortunately, as a small business, you typically just don't have that leverage. As a big business, you might have dedicated internal security teams, and where you don't, maybe you contract out, so you might have dedicated SOC resource 24/7. Again, as a small business, that's a lot more difficult to achieve. And of course, the tooling integration is likely better. If you turn up to a vendor and as a big enterprise and you say, well, we want to take your software, but you don't support this integration with our other software that we want, you have the leverage to make that happen, to get them to implement it as a requirement for your contract. So these are just some of the common differences between the two. Now, thinking about the common challenges that SMEs face, I have discussed this extensively with ChatGPT. That's not a joke, by the way. So I went through a lot of different permeations of this to sort of distill it down in a way that I thought was sensible, reasonable, and we could possibly cover in the time frame. And that might be the tricky part. Now, These will not apply to every SME. Every business is different. But in general, your common problems that SMEs are going to face are expertise, training and education, suppliers and supply chains, compliance requirements, problems of scalability, your dependence on off-the-shelf software, your challenges with BYOD, and the perception of being a low-value target. Those are the things that really hinder you the most, in my opinion. So we'll take a look at expertise first. I love this quote, know thy enemy and know thyself, in 100 battles you'll never be defeated. That's from Sun Tzu's The Art of War. The whole concept being, if you don't know what your problems are, it's difficult to solve them. So 40% of SMEs say that a lack of skilled security personnel is a barrier to maintaining a security posture. I think that seems self-evident, to be honest. I think if you don't have the expertise, you are going to struggle to implement a security program. So there's a question of, well, what drives a requirement for expertise? It might be a digital transformation program. Perhaps as a small business you were largely paper-based, now you've decided you want to technologize it all up. Maybe you want to move into the cloud from an on-prem installation. That is a great requirement for security expertise. Doing these things sound easy, but actually to lift and shift a full production stack, that can be quite a difficult and daunting task. It can require re-architecture, and having security expertise at that point in time is a really good place to have it, because again, if you have to re-architect at a later date, that can be a lot more difficult. When it comes to data protection, obviously you'll have compliance requirements in terms of how you handle customer data. Knowing what your requirements are, that is a skill in itself. You need people that are up to date on the latest legislation, and therefore having expertise in-house or having the ability to go out for expertise is really important. Customer expectations is probably, I would say, one of the biggest drivers. At the end of the day, as businesses, what drives us to do certain things is the expectations and requirements from our customers. If no customers expected us to spend money on security, a lot of companies probably wouldn't bother. But the fact that customers expect it certainly drives the requirements for us, and it drives it for a lot of businesses. And of course, there are a lot of headlines at the moment. You see every couple of months there's a big hack or something, people losing data left, right, and center. So that's probably actually one of the best things for putting cybersecurity on your senior leadership team's radar. Just keeping on top of the news. So if you find something that, something comes out, being able to forward that to your CTO, your CISO, and saying, actually, this has happened, are you aware of this? That's a great thing for making them aware and keeping your senior leadership team up to date on the latest developments. Of course, since COVID, we've had a big push for remote working. For a lot of businesses, that was a big change. They didn't necessarily know how to handle that, and there's obviously a lot of work with third parties coming in to help them secure devices as they went remote. So these are all great reasons for requiring expertise to come in. Now, of course, as an SME, your big issue is that you might not have the expertise in-house to implement a security program. So the first thing you really need to do is to work out what expertise you've actually got. Is there anything that you can leverage as a place to start? And I would say that the best place to start actually is probably in your IT team. And the reason is most people in IT have been around for a little while, and chances are this is not the first time they've had to implement a security program. So they might not be completely up to date on everything. They might not understand all the compliance standards, but things like patching of servers, rolling out updates, monitoring all the devices in your estate, they'll probably have experience in that, and that is a great place to start. On the similar front, looking at development, your developers are probably, well experienced in themselves. They will know that they have technical debt that needs to be dealt with, and that includes vulnerabilities, that includes package updates, and as long as the business prioritizes these things and doesn't push it out for feature work, then these are things that you can start to implement very, very easily. Of course, the big thing with SLT teams, senior leadership teams in small, medium-sized enterprises, is that they themselves are less clued up on security. And therefore, it's really the responsibility of the people in the business that are clued up to be pushing that back to them, making sure that they understand the risk. Because all your decisions in the business are derived from your senior leadership team, and if they don't understand the problem, they can't prioritize it or give it the priority that it needs to have within your business context. So, how much experience do you actually need if you're hiring somebody? Now, I've come up with this triangle. There's probably a variation of it out there already. what I would say is that your average users and your technical users, people that are probably hobbyists, they are probably the majority of the business, but they are not the people to implement your security program. They just don't have the technical capability. Your IT employees, they will have been involved probably in a security assurance program before, so they are really good for getting them to implement the program. And then you have what I would call the level above, which is the information security professionals. That's typically people that work in compliance. They are great people to run your information security program because they're all about numbers and compliance and meeting standards. Whereas your top tier technical experts, people that can write buffer overflows or exploit cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, in terms of implementing a security assurance program, that's too much. Those are not skills that you need, not skills that are going to really help you as a general business. So you really want to focus on hiring good people in category 2 and 3, I would say. So it's a question of what expertise do you actually require when you're hiring? I would say there are two things you want to look for. You want to look for expertise on helping you secure your business systems, and then expertise on helping you secure your products. So you need people that can think about, how do we know if a device is secure? How do we know if we have visibility of the vulnerabilities in our state? And then on the development side, it's like, well, okay, if we have these vulnerabilities, what does that patch process look like? How do we know with certainty that something has been remediated? All these different things. This is a very short list, but the best thing you can do is basically do a gap analysis, put together everything you think you're missing, and then go out to market and look for people that can really cover that expertise for you. And when it comes to hiring people, you've got 3 options really to get that expertise in your business. You can go out to market and you can hire people. Now again, you want to be careful. You want to hire a broad range of skills. Get everything as much as you can that's applicable to the role you need from people. And of course, the problem at the moment is you are hiring in a competitive market. And so at the moment, hiring dedicated cybersecurity expertise is not a cheap option. But I guess the argument I would make is it is a necessity. If you want to provide assurance to your business, to your SLT team, to your customers, this is something that is worthwhile investing in. Now, if you don't want to bring in somebody full-time, you can go to third parties. You can look for consultancy help. And to do things like gap analysis, if you don't have the ability to do that in-house, that is a great option. But it is an option that becomes very expensive very quickly. So a great short-term option, but not a good long-term. The last option is that you start to train your existing staff. Again, people that already have some sort of familiarity, people that are in your IT team, developers that are interested in security, these are all great people to train. The problem is return on investment takes time. You're not going to be able to say, wow, you're our new security guy to your IT person, and then next week they're going to be able to start implementing a program. That's not going to work. So you have to realize that it's an ongoing process. And it's not going to return dividends overnight. And of course, it can create other problems. If you start saying, well, you're now a security guy, you're going to help us bring this in, that starts to put pressure on them, might take away from their existing duties. And so if you want to start training staff, you have to be prepared as a business to support them. So let's have a think about training and education. So there's a lot of different types of security training that might be applicable to an SME. In general terms, security training which is widely accessible and raises education standards is probably the best. And across the business, you're probably looking at just general security awareness training. Even things like running phishing simulations, teaching users not to click dodgy links in emails, that is a great place to start. When I think one of the themes of this presentation really is aim for the easy options that give you the most benefit. That's the best place to start. It sounds very obvious, but you'll be amazed how many people don't start at that. Even things like password management, teaching users to pick strong passwords, to not reuse passwords for different systems, a great place to start. I see there it says updating passwords regularly. I believe that is actually not NCSC guidance now. I believe the recommendation now is that you should just let them maintain their passwords for a longer period of time. That's up for debate. And then in terms of your, again, regulatory requirements, training on data protection and privacy, how you handle sensitive documents within the business, how you watermark documents so that people know they're sensitive. All these things are great training. And if you've ever joined a reasonably sized business, the first thing that you'll see is they'll say, okay, sit down, here's a bunch of mandatory training, you have to do all of it. This is the sort of thing that will be included. It's things that businesses consider standard, everybody has to do. For developers, secure development training is definitely a great place to start. Again, some people will have had some sort of training before, some people will not. But there's certainly no harm in revisiting it with people, because obviously new things and issues come out all the time. There are tons of free resources that can be used for it, and for an SME, that's probably a great place to start, rather than bringing in dedicated training sessions. If you do look at commercial options where you want to have 12 developers sit in a room, suddenly the prices rack up. Usually it's done on a per head basis, probably costing you at least £1,000 per head. So costs start to rack up very quickly. I'm a huge proponent of solutions like Udemy, online self-study. I've done a lot of that for my certifications, and I really recommend it as a way to teach people. The problem with these things is it's all self-driven, so people have to be motivated to do it, and that's why, again, you want to really invest in people that are interested, because they are the ones that you will get the return on investment for. It's also worth to keep in mind that you want to teach people things that are relevant to the role you want them to inhabit. There's no point teaching web application developers about buffer overflows, because it's really not applicable to their job, unless you're building your stack in C#, C++, and if you're doing that, there's probably other problems going on. So you want to keep it relevant. And in terms of your secure development lifecycle, one of the things I find is training on the actual tooling you're going to use. That is very important. Making sure that people understand the processes, so that if a vulnerability is highlighted, you go to run your pipeline to deploy your software, and it comes up and says, you're running a package that has a new critical vulnerability, and the idea is that it's going to break your development pipeline, not let you go into production. A lot of the time, if developers are not clued up, they don't expect that to happen, they start panicking. They go, the pipeline doesn't work. Well, the pipeline does work, and it's done exactly what it's meant to do. So it's really about having people understand the processes and policies around secure development in your business. I think we've crashed. No, the buttons just stopped working for some reason. So how can the training challenges be addressed? You've got a couple of different options. The best one, in my opinion, is to hire team players, hire people that have expertise and are happy to share it. You get no amount of times that I've worked with people who are really knowledgeable, but they're really guarded, and I don't want to tell you how things work or how they did it. And that's a problem. Those are not people that typically stick around in the business. The best thing you can do is support staff. If staff want to learn, then you should support them in that, because it only benefits your business in the long term, and it helps promote a culture where secure development is something we care about, and like securing your applications and the way you use everything in your business, it just becomes ingrained. So I definitely recommend that. And the last thing is to make sure that you, as a business, understand the value of training and what it can bring to your organization. And again, this requires buy-in from your senior leadership team. If your senior leadership understand the value of training, then you're golden. But I've seen organizations where they don't understand the value of it, they don't offer it, none of their staff get trained, and eventually their staff say, well, I'm not really getting a lot out of this apart from a paycheck, and then they leave. So you need to be careful of that. So let's have a quick think about the challenges with suppliers and supply chains. So we are in a global economy now, and that means that supply chains are increasingly difficult to manage. Now, we can reduce some of our exposure to this risk by conducting risk assessments against our suppliers, understanding who their suppliers are, and having a better idea of what that supply chain actually looks like. Now, the problem is at the moment, you might use lots of different suppliers. We might buy a couple of laptops from this vendor, a couple more from this vendor, And the problem is that means in order to have proper visibility, you have to do a risk assessment against all your vendors. And the problem with that is that takes time and it takes resource. And again, if you're an SME, those are the two things you're probably short on. So one option is to prioritize critical suppliers, people that are a little bit bigger and have a little bit more mature security process themselves, that you can ask for evidence of. The problem, of course, is that sometimes vendors are a little bit shifty on what their security practices actually are. Sometimes, especially if they're smaller vendors, they don't want to really share with you how they do things, because what they tell you and then what they can evidence to you that they actually do are often very different. Sometimes you have a couple of options. If they are a big business, and if, in particular, if they operate in the States, they might have gone through what's called a SOC 2 audit. A SOC 2 audit will largely tell you what all the gaps in a business's security processes are. And because of that, well, first of all, it's very expensive to do. I think it costs between like 80 and 100 grand a year to get a SOC 2 audit. And then second of all, businesses don't really want to give it out because, as I say, it tells you everything that's wrong with the business from a security point of view. So if you want to view a company's SOC 2 report, typically you have to be a big customer and you have to make it worth it for them to share that information with you. And you probably also have to sign an NDA because they want contractual obligation that you are not going to share that with anybody else because that could materially harm their business. Now, of course, because supply chains are now quite long, one of the problems we have is supply chain attacks, where the compromise of one entity in the supply chain can affect the security of everybody else up the chain. You can try to mitigate this, primarily through intelligence sharing mechanisms, so that if one of the suppliers does get compromised, you are made aware of it in a timely manner, and factoring that into your incident response plan, so that if something does happen, you are in a position to react to it quickly and in a sensible manner. So it's that pre-planning ahead. So as an SME, your resources are constrained, and it's impractical to investigate security posture of all your suppliers. So again, what you want to do is focus on your critical suppliers, understand their security posture, and then rely on them as heavily as possible. Like many other aspects of security, your compliance requirements not only apply to you as a business, but they also apply to your suppliers, especially if you are using any data sub-processors. They might be processing the data on your behalf, but ultimately it is you as the entity that's data owner that is responsible for that data. So you have to make sure that your businesses you work with are handling your data appropriately, and one of the best things you can do for that is contractual obligations. Make sure that any requirements you have are in your contract so that it's legally enforceable. So I want to talk quickly about pen testing. So this is not applicable to just SMEs. This applies to anybody that goes out to procure pen testing as a service. So a couple of things. What drives pen testing? So this is not an exclusive list, but in general, compliance requirements, i.e. we need to meet a compliance standard that says we test our, let's say, applications like once a year with a third-party provider. Policy requirements, so what we say we do internally, and therefore what we tell our customers we do. And then customer requirements. Customers come to us and say, well, our compliance requirements say that every solution we use has to be tested once a year, and so therefore we expect you to do that. And again, customer requirements is typically what drives most things in business. Now, I have a big bugbear with third-party pen testing. First of all, I think it's an inherent conflict of interest. So I'm not saying this applies to us as a business, just to clarify, but as a procurer of a pen test report, what do you want out of that? Now, in reality, what you want is a report with absolutely nothing in it. Because what you're going to do is you're going to take that report and you're going to give it to a customer that asks to see it, and you're going to say, look how brilliant we are. There's no findings. There is nothing in that report. And that means when you go to a third party and say, we want a pen test, and they go, okay, we're going to give you this pen tester for a week or however long it is, they can literally sit on their hands. They can do absolutely nothing, and you're going to be happy with that. And that's a problem. It's a conflict of interest. Now, even if they don't sit on their hands, if they do something, the assurance you get is actually super patchy. What do you get from a pen test, right? So if they find stuff, that's good. That is some level of assurance, but you don't know what they tested, right? Not really. Did they test all your APIs? Possibly. They said they did, but you get no evidence of it. So I think that's a problem. Not all pen testing is equal. Majority of pen test consultancies in the UK, their profit margins run on the back of juniors, which means, you sign up for a pen test, you sign the contract, and they go, okay, here's a guy, he's 3 months out of university, doesn't really know much, but he's your pen tester. And that's not to say that they couldn't be good, but there is a wide variety of skill within pen testing, and some people are a lot better than others. So I have a problem with that. One of the issues with that as well is really the scoping process for pen testing. People don't really understand how your solution works, and therefore they don't really know how to provide you assurance of that. Typically, people will miss things. So I'll leave that there. These are problems for the pen test industry to solve, and if somebody can solve these, I would use them, because these are big problems that nobody ever talks about. So I'll leave that there. So a couple of recommendations. Risk assess your suppliers, ask them for evidence of their security practices, and use contracts to enforce them. So let's talk quickly about compliance. So similar problems. As an SME, you have limited resources and expertise. You have problems with training. You have third parties that you use as data sub-processors, and because of that, you have compliance requirements that fall on them. You have to make sure that they meet your compliance requirements, and contractual obligation is the best way to do that. One of the most important things when it comes to compliance in a small business is understanding what the requirements are that you have to meet and what the penalties of not meeting those compliance requirements are. And that's where you probably want to look at bringing expertise from a compliance point of view into your business. One of the interesting things about compliance is that it is geographically specific. So, for example, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with GDPR. You're probably familiar with CCPA, which is the Californian Consumer Protection Act. These basically dictate how you process the data of people in those jurisdictions. And the interesting thing is it doesn't apply where you are or where you service these people from. It's the fact that you process their data. So again, you have to be aware of these and make sure you're compliant, because the non-conformity can cost you. So the best thing you can really do from this point of view is to conduct a compliance assessment, to establish a compliance program if you feel you need one, bring in people that are capable and have the expertise to do it, and then define within your business who is responsible, who can drive that, and really put you on a right footing in terms of compliance requirements. And you can always engage with your regulatory authorities. They're not evil, and they'll be able to give you an idea of what the upcoming changes are so that you can meet your compliance requirements in the future. So, I want to just give you an analogy about scalability. So first of all, here's a quote. Scalability involves having systems, hardware or software, operate at the right size for current or expected context without pause and without the need for sudden refactoring or re-architecting activity. I think that's a great description of what scaling is, actually. Imagine you're Amazon. Let's say to service Amazon.com, you use 100 web servers a day. Well, it turns out it's Black Friday, and 100 web servers isn't enough. You need 500 web servers. Scalability is the ability to bring on dynamically additional web servers to service that demand, and then when Black Friday is over, to drop that capacity all the way back down to what you require at a time. So it's the ability to scale up and to scale down. So the challenges that SMEs face with this are, as a small business, you're probably very invested in manual processes. Now, that's a problem because manual processes don't scale well. In terms of patching servers or deploying applications, that's fine if you're doing like one application, two application. If you want to do like 500 applications, it's infeasible. So you really need to work out where your bottlenecks are in terms of scalability so that you can address them. As an SME, tooling can be difficult. Economies of scale means that you can't sometimes purchase licenses for the tools that are really going to help you. And sometimes you have to rely on open source software alternatives to do it. Again, not ideal, but these are the differences between being an SME and being a large business where you have those resources. Employee churn obviously could be an issue. You might have a couple of people that understand how your solution works, how it's deployed, and they're very capable of implementing the infrastructure as code templates required to scale. But then if they leave the business, you might have a problem. So you always have that bottlenecking of employee capability you have to be really aware of. And it's the same for development security as well. Manual processes are your real problem. Being able to deploy using pipelines, I mean, that's been around for 10 years now, and that is a godsend. That has really changed the game. Before I joined the business, a deployment for us across multiple geographical stacks in different regions, that would take like a full day for somebody to do manually. That was 10 years ago. Now we can deploy in like 20 minutes. It's a game changer. You need to be careful of short-term decisions, especially short-term architectural decisions. When you're a small business, there is a temptation to do things as quickly as possible in order to facilitate future development. But the problem with that is you can get yourself into a bottleneck later on. So thinking a little bit further ahead of the line can really help you. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is really left shift. It's commonly accepted that it's cheaper to fix vulnerabilities early on in the development lifecycle than it is to fix them once they hit production. So the best thing you can really do from a development point of view is to change the culture in your development team, to begin to implement left shift and to start to see that benefit early on. Because once you start building up technical debt, that becomes a lot more difficult to manage. So being on top of it is the best way forward. And just to summarize it, best thing you can do is ditch the manual processes. So, as a small business, you're very dependent on software you can buy. You don't have the scale to be able to negotiate and walk in and say, well, actually, your software doesn't quite do what we need, so we need you to make changes, otherwise we're not going to buy it. For a contract for $5,000 a year, nobody's going to bother. If your contract was $500,000 a year, they'll be bending over backwards to change your software for you. So that's just something you have to be aware of. One-size-fits-all solutions are unfortunately what you're dependent on, and sometimes that might not be brilliant. You might not get the integrations you want, and sometimes you just have to work around that. Of course, there are challenges that come with that. Sometimes the default configurations for software is not particularly secure out the box. Often you'll have the ability to change it to whatever your requirements are, but not always. So when you purchase software, you just have to be very aware of these things. Of course, a lot of software now is SaaS-based, which means you have a shared security model. Typically, you're responsible for the data. The application owners will be responsible for that, and then they'll probably run in the cloud somewhere, which means they'll have an infrastructure provider that's responsible for that. And that shared security model might not work for everybody. So, again, in risk assessing and being aware of exactly how everything works, that's a good way to do it. And I'll just say that when you purchase off-the-shelf software, one of the best things you can do is to pick software with a strong track record. I'm sure you're all familiar with Okta. They've had a couple of compromises in the last couple of years, and I know people that were using them as an identity provider have moved away from them as a result, and will never go back. And it's not necessarily the fact they got compromised, it's the way they dealt with it. So these are all problems to be aware of. Just thinking about BYOD as a challenge. Now, as we've moved to remote working, this has become more relevant. It's popular, it's free, because people already have devices, and it typically allows people to use things that you might not generally support, Macs being the common one. People in businesses love to use a Mac. Most businesses want to give out Windows devices, and for a lot of people, that's a good trade-off. They've got a Mac, they can use it. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's very difficult to control employee devices. There are issues around data loss prevention, how you keep your data safe on somebody else's device. There are compatibility issues. You can't guarantee that somebody else's iPhone that's 5 years old is still getting software updates, let alone that your MDM software is going to be compatible with it. So there are lots of different issues with using BYOD, not less the fact that everybody has admin access over it typically. So again, much harder to control. You got a couple of options with this challenge. The best one, in my opinion, is to ban BYOD. Gone. Nobody's using it. Not a problem. You can control BYOD with MDM, but again, you hit the compatibility issues. So it's a bit of a solution, but it's not brilliant. You could mandate that you can use your own device, providing it is up to date and using a supported version. And there are ways to do that. You can enforce that with compliance requirements. So it is an option. The best solution, but the most cost prohibitive one, is to replace all the devices that people might need with corporately owned devices, and that way you can manage it completely with MDM. You know exactly how it's controlled, and the best part is that if something goes wrong, if the device gets lost, you can remote wipe it. You can't really do that with somebody's personal device. So these are trade-offs. For some businesses, some choices will be better than others. And then lastly, there is this perception that if you are an SME, you are a low-value target. And what does that mean? Businesses expect, because they're small, they're less likely to be targeted. Now, I've seen statistics, especially when it comes to phishing, that suggest this is actually not the case. But the problem is the perception, because what does that mean? If you don't think you're going to get targeted, you're less likely to invest in security. It basically means you will unduly under-prioritize your security program and everything that comes around it. You'll say, well, do you know what? We do want to produce more features because that's going to bring in more business and that's more of a priority. And therefore, it's really important your SLT team understands the risks around cybersecurity, and then they can make an informed choice. And they might say, do you know what? Features are more important, and that is their discretion to make. But the important part is that they make an informed choice about it. Of course, the same thing also applies to your security development lifecycle, typically in terms of your vulnerability management. People always want to steal development points for feature work, and they will do it in any way they can. They want to push out bugs. They want to push out vulnerability remediations. And if you have an SLT team that supports them to do that, that is exactly what they'll do. So again, it's really important that people understand that security is a priority in your business, and that is pushed from a top-down level, and that allows you to do things like implement secure development practices and enforce it, which is really the biggest part. So a little bit of a overlap there, but it's not a problem. So in terms of this, your number one thing you can do is cultivate a security-aware culture. Promote your foundational security mechanisms using multi-factor authentication, single sign-on. All these things are controls you can implement for very little effort, but get huge benefit out of. And so, to conclude, and I've tried to really run through it because there was a lot more we could have talked about, we have only scratched the surface. We've covered a lot. Not everything discussed here is applicable to every business because every business is different. But again, these are some of the common security challenges that I think are applicable. Scaling securely, I would say, is about being secure enough. And this is something that I really liked when I did my preparation for CISP. There is a big focus on about the right amount of security. You don't need the most expensive solutions to be secure. You just need enough to stop somebody getting in. And I think that's a really good mindset from a business point of view, because you don't have unlimited budget as an SME. You don't have experts for every single aspect of security. So you have to make good choices. And being secure enough, I think, is the best choice you can make. These are, I guess, my primary recommendations. Cyber education of your senior leadership team is probably the biggest investment you can make. If they understand cybersecurity and push it from a top-down perspective, it really reverberates across your business. General education is also important, stops people doing dumb things. Resource constraints, compliance requirements, and poor decision constraining options, these are all problems you'll have to face. And again, you just have to make good choices around them. A lot of challenges can be addressed in similar ways: identifying skills gaps, hiring the expertise you actually require, performing risk assessments, and again, making long-term decisions. Those are probably the best things you can do to make sure that as your business grows, that you are secure in that journey. And that's everything. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Please.
You talk about pen tests.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other point, really important point, is the quality of the report that's actually usable.
Yes.
Just a list of things which...
I completely agree with you.
As you say, a student could produce, but actually doesn't tell you anything. It's the steps taken to find it.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think for me, this is where the problem of context is a big issue. So, for example, a lot of people that do the actual pen testing, they're not involved in the scoping process. And even the people who do the scoping process, in my opinion, don't often do it very well. They don't understand the context of the application, all the ways that data can be brought into the application. They never think, well, so they might say, how does data get into your application? And they'll be like, you type data in the front end. But actually, if you really speak to people, you speak to the support team, there's a back way of doing it and loading CSVs in to import customer data. But that never came up in the conversation. And I think with pen testing, context is key. And it's why I've tested lots of applications that have been tested 10 times before, and you find things that nobody else found. And it's not because you're better at testing, it's because you ask the right questions. And I think that's fundamental. And I think the whole pen test industry, in my opinion, has been going for a long time, basically without being very thorough. And they've gotten away with it. And I think there's a revolution or a shift, or somebody's going to come along and change the narrative about how we talk about things and how we do pen testing. And I think it's all going to change, because the way it works at the moment is daft. You get no assurance.
Yeah, so it's the balance between the automated piece and the manual piece.
Yes.
The manual piece of the values.
Yes, I agree. Does anybody else have a question? Yes?
So, you mentioned vendor lock-in being a potential problem.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say your vendor, SolarWinds, has had a massive breach, is now targeting a huge lawsuit by the SEC. What steps can you take to prevent vendor lock-in, or if you notice that you are, falling down that road, what can you do to pull yourself back out of it again?
It's a good question. It's probably not one I'm qualified to answer, I'm afraid. I don't typically work on the contractual requirements we have with our third-party vendors. That would be like our compliance team. I imagine you probably have some sort of get-out clause. It may be the case that if you're tied in contractually, your options are, you have to keep paying for the software, but it may be in the business interest to say, well, do you know what? That's 20 grand down the drain. We're going to procure another solution because we see the benefit of moving away from that as soon as possible. Unfortunately, some things are a sunk cost, and that's just the nature of business.
Sorry, I've got a comment on that. I think it's a resilience question. Actually having a plan B. So if you're locked in and you've got no plan B, you're going to go. For me, it's a resilience question.
So that's a good question. How many companies will have a plan B for if their supplier goes down? And I think the answer is probably not a lot. It's probably not something people do consider.
I think it's essential. It's really
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.